Perfect. So this is a talk that's hosted by alumni. So we're students of both Ottawa and Carleton, and we're doing our first talk here at the University of Ottawa this year. So this time we're actually having our first international guest speaker, Kent Leader. So he has a master's in divinity, and he does a lot of work in guiding spiritual leaders and coaching spiritual leaders on how to talk about different topics such as sex and pornography and culture. And he's also a very active member in a lot of organizations throughout the Western Hemisphere on different same subject matter as well. And so yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Is it going to be better if we turn off a light, or is it going to be better to leave it? Like, do you want to see me more or the screen? There's some text on it that's kind of small. Like, if I go to the next slide, like, can you read that? Is that okay? Better with the light off?
Fine if it turns the lights off.
Or with the light on?
Fine if the lights are off.
Where are they at? Yeah, can you control the colors? That's a good question. These are the kind of things that a good speaker figures out well before he begins speaking. That's more like you could do that. Very nice. Okay. Good. Yeah, thanks for being here, for taking the time on a Friday to come and do this and talk about a topic that everybody loves to talk about all the time openly with their friends and family. We are going to get to talk and dig into pornography and culture. We're going to take a look at the way the two have interacted and sort of the acceleration that's happened over the last several years due to the advent of the internet. And we're going to talk about why this occurs, both why this occurs from like a personal perspective for yourself and why it occurs from a cultural perspective. Today, if at any time you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. If you want more food or something to drink, don't hesitate to go get it or to use the restroom or anything like that. I'm a pastor of a church, and where I usually preach, like, people are constantly getting up all the time. I assume it's because they're just not interested in what I'm saying, but they're getting up and doing that. I'm very comfortable with that. So please make yourselves comfortable. Thank you for being here. Just to get it started, and to help you know what we're going to do and what we're not going to do today, this is not going to be a pro-pornography thing. It's going to be a clearly anti-pornography presentation. For various reasons, I don't think pornography is a wise use of sex. I don't think it's a wise use of time. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be an anti-sex presentation by any means. Sex is a fantastic thing. It's an incredible gift. And I think it's very important for many humans as part of their fulfillment and part of their experience. I think it's a vital aspect of what they do. So I don't want you to get the impression that this is in any way against sex. It's just against this thing that we call pornography that often gets put into the category of obscenity, which is that second thing. This is going to be anti-obscenity, which I know is a really hard thing to define. So we're going to play around with that a little bit at the beginning. But it's also not against free expression, because free expression is vital. I'm from America, so like freedom of speech is something that constantly everyone's talking about, whether we actually have it or not. We're always talking about it. And the ability to be able to be in a place with a group of people where we trust and respect each other enough to be able to freely express the ideas that we have is incredibly vital. It's a very important part of society and of interrelationship, and if we don't have that, we're going to struggle. But if we have freedom of expression and we only use it for our own benefit, then we've failed it. We've failed the opportunity that it is. And I think the biggest point that I want you to get out of this, that I'm going to try to drive home in this, is that this is anti-selfishness. That when we talk about our X-rated lives, when we talk about that aspect of life that deals with sex, porn, and obscenity, selfishness is the enemy here. Being focused on self is absolutely the enemy. But that doesn't mean you can't be satisfied. It doesn't mean you can't be happy. It doesn't mean you can't be fulfilled. I'm a zero-sum game kind of person when it comes to the human life and human experience. You have an amount of time. You have a certain number of things that you're going to be able to pack in and a certain number of things that you're going to do. And the value of that life that you get to live is largely found in interrelationships, relationships with other people and with God, I would suggest, and the value and depth and intimacy of those relationships. So we have to be stewards of those relationships and of the time and energy that we invest in those. And I would suggest that pornography is not good stewardship of what we are given, especially when it comes to how important of a gift sex is. So this is what we're doing and what we're not doing today. I'm sorry if you hoped to come and see a bunch of lewd images, but it's not going to happen. I'm against us doing that on a regular basis. There's a couple things in here that I had to ask Pastor Thompson if it was okay for me to put in, but for the most part, I tried to avoid it. We have to be able to talk about pornography specifically together, and I hope that beyond tonight, you talk about it more. So we have to have some kind of definition to work with on it. Have any of you ever seen this definition of pornography given before? That's fantastic. That means I get to talk about it. Okay, so this definition is an extremely commonly quoted definition of pornography. Is this pornography or isn't it? Is the question being asked. And a gentleman named Potter Stewart, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court, was handling a case. It was the state of Ohio versus a theater that wanted to show a French film very early in the days of cinema. The film was called The Lovers. I don't speak French, so it was called The Lovers. And the state of Ohio wanted to stop them from showing the film. They took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Justice Potter Stewart said, I can't bend over and make all kinds of qualifications, but I know porn when I see it. And here's where the context of that quote. He says, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within this shorthand description that is hardcore pornography. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it. And the motion picture involved in this case is not that. So he actually came down on the side of they should be allowed to show the film in the state of Ohio, and they did. But this definition stuck. People refer to this definition all the time. You're looking at an image, and that image is sexual in nature, and people say, I know that that's porn when I see it. It's a terrible definition because it literally doesn't define it at all, but it also has a lot of value. And the first thing that I wanted us to do as we deal with this is ask some questions about it. The first two questions there, does this have a pointer?
It does, but
there it is. Those two, what is useful and what is useless about this? Are you okay with talking to the people who are around you about this? If I give you a minute or something to talk to them. This is a definition, and I think it has real value when we're talking about pornography, and specifically when we're talking about defining pornography. I think it has some real value. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time, 90 seconds, so not a lot, to discuss among yourselves or think to yourself, what about this definition is valuable? What does this definition bring to the table that is actually useful when it comes to defining pornography? And then, of course, what about this definition is not valuable at all? Any questions? Okay, go. What do you think? Oh, sure. Okay. So I see it, I see it again, see it more, and it's subjective change things. Okay. So that would be do you find anything useful it at least with All right, close it down. And then if you feel like you had something good and you want to think about how you would share that with the group, that'd be fantastic. Did anyone come up with something, a point about it being, first of all, useful? What about it? What about this definition did you discuss is useful when it comes to talking about defining porn? Did anyone have a point that they thought was worth sharing or bringing out? Or did you all just hate it? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the first one we discussed was the visual aspect of it. So it's saying, I know it when I see it.
Okay.
So they're making that distinction. It has to be something visual. You have to be able to see something.
Sure.
So that's useful.
So as opposed to like erotic audio or erotic literature?
I mean, I guess that's, yeah.
Sure.
That's what's useful about it.
There's at least a definition in this verb
Yeah.
that at least qualifies something. It's not a bunch of pronouns. Sure.
I think it shows the subjectiveness of it, so one person might think, yeah, that's pornographic, but somebody might disagree.
I think that's incredibly key. I think that the chief, the most valuable thing is this word and this word. That it's purely subjective. That it's about one person looking at a thing and feeling like that is pornographic. There's something about this that falls into the category of obscene. And it allows us to define porn, at least at the beginning, as different from one person to another. And at least allows us to have some room to do that. Did I see what I have?
Sorry, so just to clarify, are we talking about the usefulness of the definition or the usefulness of porn itself?
The definition. This particular definition. Not the usefulness of pornography. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The usefulness of pornography. Good clarifying question. Other things that you liked about this definition? Subjectivity is the main one. So, yeah.
Not that I liked it, but using that as a parameter forces, if you were going to use that, forces you to have a conversation with yourself about what, and explore maybe your own thinking in a way that you weren't driven to before.
Right. So what's great about it is that it's an audience-based definition. That this particular definition of pornography is based on those who are receiving, who are taking in the things. And there's a lot of truth and a lot of value in identifying pornography that way. Yeah.
It lets you set a boundary.
Right. I know it when I see it. And when I see something beyond that, I'm going to know what's no good. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of good in that. What do you find useless, particularly, about this definition, then, the second question?
Just the converse of what you said, if I don't understand what someone else's boundaries are, their utility in using that and communicating that definition to me, I don't know how to relate to it.
Right.
I don't know where their limits are. I don't know where we, differ in terms of our ethics and our laws.
Yep. This definition can't help us define pornography. This definition can help you define pornography, but it can't help us define pornography. What else came up as you were talking about? If a pornographic magazine falls out over in the woods, is it still porn? Like if no one's there to see it, is it still pornographic?
Well, I'm just also thinking like, it can lead to sort of a temptation to want to go, because it sets a boundary, it can kind of lead to setting, viewing something you say, well, that's not quite porn, because I haven't quite gone past the limit. So then that's, yeah.
Yep, and what we talked about over here was similar to that this can then change for you over time, right? Like if you know when you see it, and then you see it for a while and it gets normal to you, then pornography is going to become something different, something more pornographic by your definition than it previously was, which makes it a fluid definition, which again makes it very difficult to use particularly well. And to what I was saying before, if a porn magazine is sitting in the woods and there's no one there to see it, it's still porn. So I know when I see it, like, can we qualify it with that kind of a time marker that it has to do just simply with experiencing it? I think that's a very important question to ask. Are there things that are definitely pornographic all of the time, regardless of the person that's looking at them? We don't get that answer from these words. The last question here, though, I think is interesting, and we've talked about it already, but one of the big debates that comes up is in the world of art, particularly art that uses nude forms, and whether or not art that uses nude forms is pornography or is pornographic. That someone can make a beautiful sculpture, and to one person they say, that is indecent, like I'm going to hide my kids from that sculpture, and then a whole bunch of other people are like, kids, look at this amazing sculpture, you should really see this incredible work of art. It's a phenomenal thing. How does this definition affect the debate between the erotic in art and the pornographic? Yeah.
Exactly what you just said. One person's gonna say it is, one person's gonna say it is.
Right. It allows us to admit that there is subjectivity within that debate, that does matter from one person to another, but that there's also the issue of the person who's making it, the person who is producing the thing. When it comes to pornography versus a piece of art, what is it designed to do? The person who is producing and creating the thing, are they making it in order to sexually arouse someone, or are they making it in order to glorify something about the human body or something about the human experience that they would like to make sure people are paying attention to and see? That distinction becomes very important and is also very subjective, as you just mentioned. All right. Here are some things that I think should be part of actual working definitions of pornography. I have 4 points up here. We can argue about them in certain ways. We just talked about the first one, that pornography is determined by purpose or result, by producer or by audience, that these two things both matter when we're defining and talking about pornography. I think that we can say that if a guy sets out to make a titillating video and it sits in the woods and no one sees it, it's still porn. It's still a pornographic thing based on who produced it and what it was produced for. Second point, pornography is inherently negative because it empowers selfish sex. That's what I was getting into before. And it's I'm going to suggest that this needs to be part of the definition for the word pornography. When we're labeling something as pornographic, we're labeling it as inherently negative in value based on the fact that it encourages selfishness when it comes to sex. Because human beings were created to have connection, intimate relationship. And you have a certain amount of time to get as much intimate relationship out of the life that you have before the life that you have is over. And this does not add to that. It does not add to your ability to have that kind of a relationship with the person who's in a pornographic image or film. Next, pornography removes the agency of the subject. So when we're talking about and defining pornography, we're always going to be talking about something where the person who we're looking at, or the subject that we are looking at in it, doesn't have control over the situation, doesn't have the ability to control the situation. So when it's a video, obviously that person has no control over what you do in that situation. When it's an image in a magazine, then that person has no control over what you do in that situation. So it removes agency from that person, and it makes use of a communicative medium, which is a major part of pornography, that it's always going to be something that happens in a communicative way through some medium, whether it's paper or digital or audio even. I think we could go so far as to talk about audio or literature, written literature that can be pornographic in the way that it functions and works. So these things I at least want us to consider as parts of a definition for pornography that we can use when we're thinking about it and talking about it. Are there questions specifically about these 4 things? We will continue to define this as we go on, but I don't want to just skip over something. What's that? I'm going to get there. It's like the next thing. Yeah. Yep. Here's an example. I'm going to give you like 5 seconds to look at it, and then I'm going to take it away. Right? So those 3 images that were just there, you kind of get the full gamut of it. The one on the left, this is a very famous statue of Venus, right? It's a very ancient statue. It was found in France. It's a beautiful statue. It's incredible. But she's holding her dress away from her backside. Like, she's intentionally showing it. There's something about it. And a lot of people would point at that and have one thing to say, and a lot of people would point at that and have another thing to say. one in the top right corner is an actual beginning of a pornographic film, right? Like, so this is a woman. She's more clad than the other two, right? But it's the actual beginning of a pornographic film. And the bottom right one, anyone know what that is? What's that? It's Game of Thrones. It's Game of Thrones. It's a scene from Game of Thrones. Right after that couple, well, they made love. And then he's getting up and walking away. But I chose it because it's so parallel to that that you get. What's interesting about Game of Thrones, how many of you watch Game of Thrones? I watched Game of Thrones. I have seen it. What's interesting about Game of Thrones and the pornography question is Game of Thrones uses nudity, right? There's nudity in Game of Thrones. And at the beginning, in the earliest seasons, that nudity was pretty pornographic, like no question. That they were using it in order to entice and arouse. That was the reason it was on the screen. The writers of Game of Thrones, they actually said, for those early seasons, we had a lot of things we needed to inform the audience of. So when we knew we were going to have a long scene with a lot of dialogue that kind of set the scene for what's going to happen in future seasons, we just put naked people in it, because then people paid attention the whole time. Like, they admitted that that was the point of doing it, the point of setting it in a brothel, or the point of having some nudity in that scene. Later on, though, in the show, they start to use it in remarkably different ways that are absolutely not pornographic. Like, they use nudity in such a way as to communicate something that's quite powerful, particularly in our culture. And it's a very interesting thing to observe and to think about. That sort of distinction between pornography and art happens just within that show in Game of Thrones. So anyway, we have kind of a definition going for pornography, and now what we're going to do is we have three parts. We're going to talk about the history of porn. We're going to talk about the sort of current status of porn, and then we're going to get into that why question. Before we do, there's some housekeeping things you should know. If you have a question that comes up that you don't want to ask out loud because it's about pornography, you can text it to Pastor Thompson. My phone doesn't work here, so you can't text it to me. But his number is on both sides on the board, so it'll always be there. Like, if you have a question that you want an answer to on this topic or connected with this that you don't feel comfortable asking out loud, please go ahead and text it to Pastor Thompson. We'll do a little Q&A at the end so we can cover some of these points, and he'll also be able to respond to you after I am gone from here too. Second, the notes are going to be available in two different places. They'll be at conquersthroughchrist.net, which is that logo up there. Conquers Through Christ is the organization, one of the organizations that I work for that helps people, particularly leaders, who are addicted to pornography, deal with that addiction. So we work with people all over the world. I travel all over and talk to people and consult with people and help people on this issue. So it'll be available at conquersthroughchrist.net, also at illumincontent.com. Just for clarity's sake, this is Illuminate, like the student organization. I'm a pastor of a church in South Carolina that's called Illumine. It's spelled the same. And we have a website that's called illumincontent.com where we put content up of all kinds, including this presentation. And for you guys, because you came to this, if you want to go on it and buy, like, we have CDs and all kinds of resources, like if you want to buy it, you get a discount using the code Illuminate. The discount code, though, is Illuminate, just so you get that right when you type it in. I am Kent Reeder. We already talked about this a little bit. I'm the pastor of Illumin Church in Rockdale, South Carolina. I'm currently holding an opportunity to go and serve at a different place here in Canada. It's St. Albert in Alberta, Canada. So I'll be taking a look at my two current opportunities and picking one of them in the coming weeks. I'm the content editor for Conquers Through Christ. We do, along with the consulting and stuff, we write a tremendous amount of curricula that gets used at all levels. We're working on literally a cradle to college approach to sexuality, healthy sexuality, the ability to talk and think carefully about sexuality and meet people at their different age levels for it. So we do a tremendous amount of content creation for that. And I am a porn addict in recovery. Like, one is never not, just like when one's an alcoholic, one is never not an alcoholic. I was in 6th grade and I was riding the bus and some kid handed me a magazine and I was like, holy cow, there's stuff in this magazine I've never seen before. And then somebody in the seat behind me told me that if you go on the internet, you can find a lot more of that stuff. And I had the internet. So I got into it. I was in it for a long time. And it's never not a temptation, but have found good ways to control it, and my wife is fully aware of it, and she helps with that, and I have a lot of partners who help deal with the porn addiction so that we can actually have a decent and healthy and helpful approach to sex, like in my marriage and just in the relationships that I have. So if this is a thing for you, if you use porn regularly, if you use porn in such a way especially that you wish you didn't, like to such an extent that you would prefer you didn't, this is a thing that you should get some help dealing with. You should talk to somebody about, because it truly is an addiction. The brain works with chemicals and develops an addiction to those chemicals, and if you don't have someone holding you accountable, it's going to be infinitely harder for you to get out from under the thumb of pornography, and it will have a negative impact on your relationships, both romantic relationships and platonic relationships with the opposite sex or even with the same. So I very much encourage you to do that. Pastor Thompson can connect you to lots of good resources, including Conquerors Through Christ, that can help you with this if you're looking for help with that. If you want to talk to me about it afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you or connect with you about it afterwards as well. All right. History of porn. John Steinbeck has a kind of fun quote about sexuality. He says, "What freedom men and women could have were they not constantly tricked and trapped and enslaved and tortured by their sexuality. The only drawback in that freedom is that without it, one would not be human, one would be a monster." Which is a fascinating quote because it's a pretty depressing approach to sexuality and how sexuality works. But it's also a very true approach and fair approach to sexuality and how sexuality works, particularly when it comes to our desires to use it selfishly, which is what would happen if you're getting trapped or tricked, like a rabbit who tries to get a carrot from underneath the trap and gets caught in it. So we often do when we pursue sex in a selfish manner, not looking for intimacy, but rather looking for personal satisfaction, right? And we see this happen, like this whole monster concept even, happen really early on in history. I have no idea how many of you believe in God or believe in the Bible. I do. So early on in the history of Scripture, we see a very fascinating thing happen. And I think, like, whether you think the book of Genesis is a true and accurate recounting of things that happened, or you think the book of Genesis is like a sort of morality story that helps us see things about origin, this is perfectly applicable here. I believe that this is a real thing that happened. So you have a man and a woman, Adam and Eve, and the Bible says that the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. So this is right after the whole world has been created. Everything is perfect. Nothing is wrong with it. God designed this incredible self-sustaining system that's going to work, that dignified these particular people who were humans and allowed them to live in a place that they could function and survive in, and also, more importantly, that they could connect with one another in and connect with Him in. He didn't need it. He didn't need to make it happen. He was perfectly satisfied on his own. Instead, He made this thing so that somebody else could experience perfect satisfaction by being connected to Him and by having relationships with the rest of the crown of His creation, right? And in that scenario, the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And there's really interesting things about the words that get used in this verse. The word for naked in the Hebrew here is like unbarriered. They did not have any barrier. There was nothing that was going up in between them and everything else. They were fully exposed is the idea here. And they felt no shame. The word for shame here, I prefer to use the word disappointment. So they were completely unbarriered and nothing about it was disappointing, is the thing that's being said here, right? Like the man and his wife were both naked and satisfied with that, is what's going on. And it's a very sexual concept, like especially to us now in the world that we live in the way that we live our lives and in the way that sexuality is treated. Like for a man and woman to be standing in a place together, be naked and be not disappointed in any way is a fascinating concept for it to work that way. And this is what's being described here, that everything about this works. They feel no shame. But not long after, we're in Genesis 2 here, we're in Genesis 3 right here, they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. So we talk about how that naked word means unbarriered, that there's nothing in between, right? They literally made barriers. They got leaves, they sewed them together, they put something in between them and the other person. And if you ever looked at this verse, why they did that, like what happened in their heads. So they sin, right? They decide to eat the fruit that they were told not to eat, which is the very first selfish act. They reach up and they determine that their will is more important than their connection, more important than their relationship with God. They reach up and they do this, and all of a sudden they realize they are naked and they cover up. They make garments for themselves. And I think, at least for me, growing up and thinking about this verse, I thought about it as modesty. Like, they thought to themselves, oh man, I'm naked, I should put something on. This isn't good. You know, like that dream you have when you get up to make a presentation in front of all your classmates and you don't have pants on. Like the way you feel in that dream. But the more I think about it, and the more I think about what has happened to sex, and see what has happened to sex, the more I think that maybe what was happening was less what I felt about what was going on, and more about what I thought they felt about what was going on. That Adam is thinking to himself, I need to cover up because she's looking at me different. And Eve, of course, Adam being a man, thought, I need to cover up because he's looking at me different. Because there's something selfish in the way that he's looking at me that didn't exist before. There's something self-serving in the way that he's looking at me that didn't exist before. John Steinbeck talks about how we get tripped and trapped by our sexuality, and if we didn't do that, we would be monsters. And maybe he's on the right track, but maybe if we didn't do that, we would be perfect. Maybe if we didn't do that, we would be ideal. Maybe we'd finally be in the place that sex was designed to be in. But maybe that's harder than it sounds, and I think the history of pornography is going to show us that that's quite a bit harder than it sounds. This picture is the history of porn. Or this slide. This is it. So there'll be a quiz on this later. You have three columns, and I tried to the people who are making the porn, the media that they're using for it, and then the audience that is receiving it. And it's very vague, and it's going to cover a lot of history, you can't get all into all the stories that go along with everything that's happening here, but here's kind of how I see it working historically. That at the beginning of any imagery that is directly sexual in nature and is designed to titillate, is designed to sexually arouse, you see images like these small figurines that have very large phalluses. You see images like these sculptures where the breasts are just very much larger than makes any sense. And archaeologists, people who are discovering these, are saying this is probably a thing that was done this way in order to put attention on that particular piece of anatomy, right? So you have these figurines, these sculptures, and they're made usually having something to do with gods or leaders. Usually it's an image of someone who is worshipped or somebody who is in charge. And the Pharaoh of Egypt is shown with a very significant member, right? And he does this in order to control the powerless, in order to keep them thinking what he wants them to think, in order to have some sway, in order to get what he wants over them. The people who are doing this with the small idols are doing this in order to distract or control those people who are their subjects in their religion or their subjects in their kingdom. This is typically the way that you see this used. Now there are lots of sculptures of they're good, that honor the body, that pay close attention to the body and are trying to celebrate it. But when we have ones that archaeologists and people who study history are saying this is probably kind of pornographic, this is what's typically happening. The dynamic at play is the powerful and the powerless. Beyond that, after that, then you stick with sculpture for a long time. You get the same kind of thing in paintings, where there are these murals or paintings of things, even some cave paintings that are pornographic in nature. And then you get down to where we're starting to write and perform and do things, and it makes its way into drama. You get these sort of very lewd plays, whether they're of the very ancient world or more of like a Middle Ages type world. That are lewd in order to get people to come. Like the whole point of celebrating sexuality or even having sex directly in the middle of the play is to get people to come and be in the audience. Desperate playwrights who are either worried about the amount of money they're going to make or losing their jobs if they don't do it right, or losing their heads if they don't get people to come and listen to the subject matter of the play, are putting sex right in the middle of it in order to arouse people, to get them to come and be part of and see this dramatic experience. So they're just trying to get the hoi polloi to come. It's just any person who isn't creative, any person who would be part of an audience, they're trying to get to come. Then you start to get to the invention of the printing press, or even just handmade printed things, and you get into printed pamphlets. Early printing press people, like, so Gutenberg invents the printing press like 500 years ago. And the Gutenberg printing press mostly did things that were quite religious in nature, because Gutenberg was quite religious in nature. But in those first 40 to 75 years immediately following the invention of movable type and the printing press, there were a ton of copycats. Lots of people made these because they realized there's a lot of money to be made in printing and disseminating literature. But those guys needed some way to pay for the printing presses that they had just made and the equipment and the ink that they do. So while they're waiting for some big guy like an Erasmus or a philosopher to write a book, they're printing just dirty poetry, just a lot of dirty poems, or ancient stories that are lewd and crude in nature in the way that they were. So in order to prop up their income, in order to help their business survive, they're putting up quite a bit of smut-related material, pornographic-related material, and then, here and there they're publishing something that's incredible and has lasted till today. You get then to novels. The first novel that really gets credit for being pornographic is Italian. Then the British had a whole bunch of them that happened in the 1700s. It was mostly authors who were trying to get their name on the map, right? So the failing authors writing novels for readers who are forced readers, like specifically people who are being required to read, like especially young women who in society are required to spend time each day sitting and reading, but they do not want to spend time each day sitting and reading. And so the word gets out that this particular book has this particular scene in it, or this particular scenario in it, and now all the young ladies are very eager to sit and read all afternoon and find those things that are in it. And then it starts to get shrunk. Throughout some of the wars that happened in the 1700s, 1800s, particularly in the Civil War, you saw them start to print images on playing cards. It's said that most soldiers in the American Revolutionary War or the Civil War had a picture of their sweetheart and then several pictures of boudoir type imagery that they were carrying around that they would use while they were out on the battlefield. Then you start to get into a whole different means of thing, and you get into the cinema. The beginning of film was terrible. Film started as a circus side act, right? So we figured out how we could project images and make those images move. And so we would have a tent at a circus or a festival, and in that tent you could watch like a freight train come at you for 7 seconds, and that was it. Like that was film. And so they realized nobody wants to watch this boring stuff. Let's show a woman taking off her clothes, and everybody wants to watch it. So they start to do this, and that gets picked up by organized crime in a big way. That gets picked up by organized crime because organized crime people realize they can get a lot of people to put a lot of money in to get into those kind of events. So they start to create these specific cinemas that are designed just for watching things that are pornographic, and they can launder all kinds of money through that kind of means, and they can get all kinds of clientele through that kind of means. So cinema really starts to make it happen, and pornographic cinema helped make cinema better, helped make the film better, helped make the projection better. They were part of this, and from here on, from cinema down, you're going to see porn be an absolute leader in technology. Porn becomes one of the main impetus for the advancement of technology in a lot of different ways. We get into projection, so this is where we now have the ability for just a group of people, like a group of college students, to have a projector that they can move and use in different places. And so we start to print pornographic films on those kinds of things that can get put in the projector and get put up. And stag parties develop. If you've ever heard of stag parties, where a bunch of college males would get together and watch these things. They'd be on in the background, they'd be watching pornography in the background. And this was great because they could mail them. They didn't have to worry about a lot of distribution stuff. They were able to just get these people to pay money to do this thing. Then you get into the Betamax type film, which is probably none of you know about. Is a way of showing movies, and it starts to get competition from this thing that's called a VCR, which my sister doesn't know what that is, right? But from this thing that's called a VCR, especially in the 70s and 80s. And it was absolutely, everyone agrees, it was porn that made the VCR win. Because they could put more data on a video cassette, more image on a video cassette than they could put on those, and they mailed better. They were easier to reproduce. So you'd have these mafia guys and other what started to become big porn, people who would own just warehouses full of reproducing machines for video cassettes, and they'd just be pumping it out, and they could mail it all over the world, wherever people wanted to have that. And then all of a sudden, everyone's getting a VCR in their house. So now you don't even have to go to a party. You don't have to go to a party to see it projected on the wall. You can be in the privacy of your own home. You can watch porn off of a VCR. Then the internet hits, and everything completely changes. The internet hits, and it starts out all text. So at the very beginning of the internet, porn wasn't really a driver for it, right? Military was more of a driver at the beginning of the internet, and business was a driver for it. But then they started to realize, hey, you know what we can do with this? We can share files. We have these sort of chat things, these places we can go, and we can share files. They were called bulletin board systems. A bulletin board system was a thing where, like if you had a computer and I had a computer, I could basically log onto your computer, see everything that you had, and take whatever I wanted. So it's a file sharing method. So they started to just like mad scan porn magazines. They were just scanning those images like crazy, especially once we got to the point where you could share images and get those images with zipped files. And so like almost the entire archive of Playboy, almost the entire archive of Hustler and some of those major magazines have been scanned, because whoever had the largest database would get the most people to log into their BBS and sign up and pay money to get this thing. And then you get into image sharing, internet entrepreneurs, those BBS people who are doing that for largely a world of email and like very simple internet communication. And we get into video streaming, which has very much been pushed forward by porn. Like you'll see some stats later on how much video gets streamed that is pornographic, but they've had to have high standards for compression and the ability to promote and get their videos in people's hands quickly. And that led to ubiquity for porn. Like, I think in general, people just expect people to have seen porn. It's where we're at in society right now. And the next big thing is going to be VR, virtual reality, where you put on your goggles and you can experience pornography through that. Like, you can already do it, just not everybody has a VR machine right now. So we're not really at the point where that becomes so ubiquitous, but it gets really for the addicts, people who need a next level experience is where we're starting to see VR become very valuable. As you walk through this, it's fascinating, especially from here down, from cinema down, the way that pornography has moved the ball forward in technology with the internet. When it came to image sharing, in 1999, it was estimated that 83% of the images shared on the internet were pornographic. 83% of the images shared on the internet in 1999 were pornographic, which is just amazing. Like, you talk about getting market share, that's phenomenal. They did it right, you know. Other things that they invented during this time were things like, you know, two-step identification, that really annoying thing where you sign up for an account on a website, then you have to go to your email and click on a link in that email. That was invented by porn. Because porn gets a lot of fraudulent claims, like people will call the company and say, I don't know how this particular charge got put on my credit card. I'm sure I wasn't the one who did it, because their wife just found the charge on their credit card. And so they're like, I don't know what happened. So then they developed two-step authentication, so they could be like, no, you clicked the email. Like, you opened the email from your personal account. We know you were the one who created this and who wanted this. All kinds of things. Porn has been the chief catalyst to move it forward. There's a pretty famous quote by a dude who produced Star Trek. Without porn and Star Trek, there would be no internet. And it's true, at least in that the internet wouldn't be where it is today without porn and maybe Star Trek, but definitely without porn. It wouldn't be where it is today. It's been a major factor in making it grow. Sorry. Now, the results of this are significant in this history, and there are a couple of trends that I want to point out in this history, so you actually have some applicable information here. We look at these media and the way that it has changed, and we ask the question, why have the media changed like this? What is the reason that porn keeps being on the cutting edge of media? What is the point of porn being on the cutting edge of media? And I have these two sort of just shapes to show you what has happened. That when it was sculpture or paintings or something that was out in the public square, right, you had to have a large number of simultaneous viewers, which is very uncomfortable when it comes to pornography. Like, nobody wants to do that with a whole bunch of other people around. So it got a little bit better with drama, and a little bit better when we could have personal printed pamphlets and the novels that the women would read all by themselves and no one would know. The audience keeps getting smaller. And the playing cards, like, that's just you in your pocket. But then we get to cinema, and it has to get big again because we have to have enough people who come to pay to make it worth our time to show it up on a screen, to have this theater, to pay what we need to run the building and the business. So it gets big again, but the whole point, again, is to get simultaneous viewers down while getting potential viewership up, and that's what the other one is for, right? Like, as we go down this, your potential viewership just always gets bigger. You get down to video streaming, 20% of searches on mobile phones is porn. 20%, even now, so your potential viewership is huge now. It's fantastic from their perspective, and it keeps getting bigger while the simultaneous number of viewers gets smaller. So they're just taking away resistance. They're taking away those things that would inhibit people from watching pornography by making it as accessible as possible and as close as possible while making it private. So you don't have to worry about other people. And this is significant because it starts to speak to the history of porn in the big question of why they do this. They do it, like, why do they want a bigger audience and a more private or safer space to watch it? Why would they be interested in that? What's the point? It's not because they think porn is beautiful art that they want to share with the whole world. It's money. It's money. They want money. They want to control these people so that they can get their money. Like, this is the point, the thing that they're trying to do. Porn adapts to the producers, to the media, and to the audience. And historically, this is exactly what we see over and over and over again, from those primitive sculpted images and paintings in caves down to now having a 3D experience where you can literally buy a thing that feels like another person to use while you're experiencing VR porn. Like, it's incredible. No one's going to need other people anymore to have sexual pleasure. So it's significant because they're getting really close to this. This is what porn wants to do. They want to isolate people so that they can have them as clientele in the work that they're trying to accomplish. That rock there on the left is one of those cave paintings. It's a woman. This is the top of a leg, and this is the top of a leg, and this is chest, and this is head. So even it's also in France where they found that. Maybe 12,000 BC is the suggestion of when it was done. But porn adapts to the producers, to the media, and to the audience. This is historically the way that it works and what it accomplishes. And it always does this for selfish reasons. For the producers, it is selfish because they want to control the audience. They want the money. And for the audience, it's selfish because they want to be able to have sexual release and pleasure without any kind of inhibition or anyone getting in their way. They want to be able to do this. And if that's the goal, like if the point of sex is personal fulfillment, is being able to have sexual release personally, then they're nailing it. They are absolutely doing it right. But if that's not the point, then this is a disastrous thing, right? If the point of sex could be something different, like I've said before, if the point of sex is intimacy in relationship with another person, if the point of sex is selfless service of another person, if the most intimate thing you can do with another person is please them sexually, and that's fulfilling for a human, which it is, then this is incredibly nefarious and incredibly dangerous. It is the opposite of what this thing was given to us for. So we have to deal with that fact. And we have to deal with what it's led to now, and this is the today section. This is an old C.S. Lewis quote where he talks about, he's specifically referring to striptease, like when you go to a theater and watch women. He's making a metaphor. Now suppose you came to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and slowly lifting the cover so as to let everyone see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with their appetite for food? Hilariously, he said this, right? And he's making this big hyperbolic metaphor. We have whole shows that do this, right? We have entire shows now where on TV you get to the point where they're about to unveil the dish, and then we go to commercial break. And then you sit and you wait because you want to see what he made, right? Like, he was so accurate about what selfishness does to society. He gives us a good lesson in sex, but also a very interesting lesson in media in general. All right, so where are we today? Viewing statistics for 2016. I want you to know that I try very hard to be as neutral as I can when collecting these statistics. I use the statistics that are professionally published by pornographic sites. These aren't things that, like, the anti-porn lobby are putting out. Their numbers are usually pretty trumped up. But 15% of web use in 2016 is provably pornographic. Like, the desire of using the internet at that time was to find pornography. 11 of the top 300 most used sites in the world are direct pornographic sites. And that's a big deal that they're direct pornographic sites, because of the top 100 sites for the US in 2016, you can get porn through 41 of them. Like things like a Tumblr or Google, places where you can easily go and find pornography, Twitter, Facebook, where you can easily go and find pornography. But 11 of the top 300 and 4 of the top 100 are direct porn tube type sites, or sites that sell pornography. In 2016 alone, we as humanity watched 5,246 centuries worth of pornography in 1 year. We're really fitting it in, guys. Good job. 35% of all downloads of media in 2016 were pornographic. The industry is currently valued at $97 billion. And this is a tougher one to put a number on. It depends a lot on how you define violent content, because some of this violent content is going to be consensual violent content. But of the pornographic videos that exist on sites, the way that they're tagged, the way that they're categorized, and the content that they have, 85% have some kind of violent content going on. This would be a situation where a person is going to feel pain as a result of what is happening in that video. So this is where we're at. That violent content point is important because a decade ago, the number was a lot lower. The amount of violent content is without question going up. The amount of violent content that's being made in pornography is without question going up. I don't buy into the idea that, like, if you start to watch porn, you're going to guaranteed have to watch worse and worse stuff. That's been patently proven false many times. But what's happening is the normalization of pornographic viewership is just making people much less inhibited in the things that they're going to watch. So it's not like some guys down this terrible rabbit hole that's going to lead into violent content necessarily. It's more like people are less inhibited and they're willing to search for things that are more extreme more regularly, so they don't have self-shame about violent content when it comes to their self-fulfillment and sex. Does that distinction make sense? Okay, I think it's a very important distinction, because a lot of people end up getting kind of a, like, when you find out someone's a porn addict, you're like, oh, you're going to become a rapist. And that's not true. It's certainly, there are cases, there are anecdotal cases of that, but statistically, that's not an accurate thing to say exactly. Now, beyond viewership, there's exposure. In 2016, the average exposure, first exposure to pornographic imagery was at age 8. This is very significant, I think, because at age 8, your ability to process pornographic images is nil. You do not understand what you are seeing. This is going to come through an advertisement. It's going to come through, when I was in 6th grade, somebody handed me a magazine on the bus. Whatever it is that's going to be that first exposure. But the average age right now is 8. About 66% are going to see it at age 8 first. Males over 16, 90% say that they have watched and used porn for self-sexual gratification. Females over 16, 60%. And this is an international statistic, it's not just a US statistic. It's an international statistic in places where people have regular access to the internet. 34% of porn exposure, 30% of people said that they had unwanted exposure to pornography in 2016. So they saw it somewhere that they didn't want to have to see it, and it came up. $3 billion child porn industry value. That number is much higher than it was a decade ago, and very, very concerning, because there's no one at a leadership level who is arguing that child pornography is okay. There is no one suggesting that this is a legal or good or helpful thing. And this industry is very damaging, not just to the people that are watching child pornography, but also to the people who are being used, who are being filmed in child pornography. And like I said before, 20% of mobile searches. So this is kind of where we see things currently today. It's very normal. I've got a clip for you to watch that kind of, I chose it because it illustrates the sort of ubiquity of it and some of the things that happen when people make it so common. So, I have no idea if people watch Friends in Canada, so I hope that was okay. But it's a very good diagnosis of sort of the normalcy of it, I think, first of all. The expectation of men to be more into it than women, which is somewhat false, but also somewhat true. The expectations that change as a result of porn use, which is very true. That people's expectation of what sex should be for and should be like changes when they talked about the bank teller and the pizza delivery woman not wanting to come in and see the bedroom. But most importantly, it gives us this idea that it's not negative, that the existence and the commonness of porn is just a perfectly fine and harmless thing, and boys will be boys. And that's the way it is. So where are we today? We still have that basic concept that boys will be boys and they need release and all kinds of things like that. In the same vein, Mr. Hugh Hefner just passed away, right? And it's an interesting thing because I am connected to a lot of people who know that I am pretty against porn. And I saw a lot of people on social media and other conversations saying things like that guy did a lot of stuff to hurt to promote the subjection of women to the gaze of men, and that guy did a lot of things to corrupt the way people approach sex and things of that nature. And I don't disagree that in some ways Playboy magazine made porn more common, that it made it more widespread, that they were geniuses in coming up with the idea that everybody has a Playboy under their mattress. Like, that was a marketing thing. More than it was just a fact of life that came out. They tried to promote that idea. You should have a secret magazine under your mattress. There are certainly things that he did that were negative, but I think the reason I put this up here and is when it comes to porn today, here's one of the biggest issues. People, after Hugh Hefner died, were saying, thank goodness that pervert's off the streets, and it's good riddance to him. We're done with that guy and the things that he's done that are negative to society. And a lot of people messaged me or in conversation with me were like, yeah, Hugh Hefner died, huh? That's awesome. And it is not. It is devastating that Hugh Hefner died. Hugh Hefner didn't understand. He didn't understand certainly what sex is for and what sex is about, but much more importantly, he didn't understand what life is for. And what life is about. He didn't understand that it was about relation and connection and being someone who serves other people in a way that offers real satisfaction. And Hugh Hefner is dead, and he is out of time. And right now we live in an era where not only is porn extremely common, but everybody thinks that the people who see sex in a different way are just judgmental jerks about those who like porn. And that's not allowed. We can't be that way about people who are into pornography. We must be compassionate towards those people that are addicted to and promoting and using and selling pornography. We must reach out and try to connect with and try to educate not only the people who are subject to pornography, but the people who are producing pornography. We have to change the way the conversation works. And I think that there are some things about the current status of porn that can do that. Most importantly, that the big porn, like Big Porn 2, which is the internet-based big porn, like the huge multi-million-dollar sites and things, they're all breaking. It's all coming apart because it's all decentralizing. There's a lot more amateur porn than there used to be, and there's a lot less professional porn than there used to be. Back in the VCR days, you could spend $1,000 shooting a porn video and easily make $50,000 off of it in first printing or in first release of it. Now, you spend $1,000 to make $1,000 back at a professional level. Now, you it's not worth it. It's not really worth the investment because there's so much amateur porn out there. An individual person through a cam site or just through promoting their own videos, they can make some money, but not a big organization, not like they used to. And that's going to allow people who have a different perspective on porn to at least enter the conversation in a new way and work individual to individual instead of having to work against this massive organization, against this massive conglomeration or corporation that's controlling the narrative. We can start to actually connect with real individuals who are hurting and who are affected. So porn today, very common, but a huge opportunity for those who view life in a different way, and especially who view sex in a different way. Now, we get to the why question, which is the whole point. This is common, but this is a porn star. Her name is Yoso, I believe is her porn name. And she asked, why did you get into porn? And she said it sounded like fun, which I think is like the same answer that people who are addicted to porn also give. Why did you start watching porn? Well, it sounded like fun. It sounded like it'd be a good thing. And as we dig into the why question, there's a couple things we have to think about. First of all, why did you get into porn? There's a myth about sexual release that we have to address. It's a myth that every person needs sexual release, that, you know, sometimes you'll hear stats banded about like men need to ejaculate within 24 or 72 hours or whatever, on the number that they're going to use to try to get their girlfriends to have sex with them. Like, it's a pure myth. The body is able of reabsorbing any unused semen. The body is able of handling that. It is not necessary from a physiological standpoint for a person to have sexual release. Is it a healthy thing to do? Yes. Is it necessary for good health? No. Is there a difference between the physiological and psychological desire for sexual release? Absolutely, and we need to acknowledge that. But does sexual release affect the tendency toward violent sex or rape? No. If you aren't able to, whether from a psychological standpoint or a physiological standpoint, that does not mean you're suddenly going to bust out in violent sex. Does not mean you're suddenly going to do something that is against what you believe is right or wrong. That's just a myth, and it's been disproven many times. Does a healthy partner-focused sexual relationship affect the tendency towards violent sex or rape? Yes. People who do have a healthy perspective on sex and what it's actually for, what it can actually accomplish, much less likely to commit a violent sexual crime. Much less likely even to view violent pornography on the internet. Like, they'll view pornography, but not typically violent pornography. So why then is porn a big thing throughout history, and is it a big thing now? I would remind you of this, which we saw before, that there's this desire for making money, and it really comes down to a power play. That each one of the producers who have developed and invested in and tried to disseminate porn, they're about power. Whether that power comes from money, whether that power comes from proving that I have better sexual anatomy than you do in the ancient sculptures, whether that power comes from taking it away from big porn, or whether that power comes from reconglomerating it. It tends to be about power, and the way that they get that power is by driving wedges in their audience, separating people from one another. You take each of these target markets, each of these people that porn was marketed to, and over again they're trying to fragment, they're trying to make it smaller, they're trying to make it more private. They gain power by separating the audience from one another and helping them and making them be more self-focused. So the audience gets self-focused in its satisfaction, and the producer gets self-focused or self-centered in their power that they gain by convincing them to do this. This is why it all happens. This is the point. It's not like someone thinks that sex is super important and we need to show everybody how to do it. It's not like somebody thinks that sex is extremely beautiful and we need to chronicle it and hold on to it. It's not like these people are trying to do something healthy or helpful to society, whether they're the audience or they're the producers. That's not what's happening. It's an entirely different thing that's going on. And no matter what, when it comes to the use of pornography, when it comes to our attempts to get away from selfish sex or self-gratifying sex, we're never going to shake this. We're always going to need to wear clothes. We're always going to need to sew fig leaves together because we are monsters, because we are corrupt in our hearts. We have a nature that is corrupt. We live in a world that wants to corrupt the way that we approach things. We're not going to shake it. But at the same time, if we're asking why we're talking about this and why this is an important thing, we have to realize that there's a goal, and it's the same thing that they had. The closest that a husband and wife can get to what Adam and Eve had when they stood there, totally unfiltered and not disappointed at all, that's what we want. That's the goal. That's the point of sex, the ability to connect that intimately with one another. So, my X-rated life is not for me, it's for someone else. Each one of us is a sexual being, and we ought to be sexual beings. But we're not sexual beings for ourselves. We're not sexual beings for our own gratitude. We're not sexual beings for our own self-fulfillment. We were made to be sexual beings for somebody else. It's why the sex organs are the way they are. Designed for somebody else. Designed to satisfy somebody else. It's why intimacy is the way it is. It requires somebody else. It is for somebody else. And as long as we can approach it this way, or start to approach it this way, we'll start to see the charm of porn melt. We'll start to see the desire to use and be involved with obscene material that subjects people and robs them of their agency as something that has no place and no value for us. We'll always have the issue of this. But we can go beyond it. We can find something better. C.S. Lewis, this is my closing. I'm almost done. I know I'm not long. C.S. Lewis, in writing the Screwtape Letters, which is, the Screwtape Letters is like letters from a demon in training to like a bigger, more powerful senior demon. Like they write these letters back and forth. And the demon in training is working on tempting this one guy. Like his whole job is to work on this one guy. And the demon in training writes him letters that are like, hey, do this, try this, think about this. This is the way C.S. Lewis decided to talk about sex, from the senior demon to the more lower demon. He says, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground, the enemy being God. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times, or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. I appreciate the chance to get to talk about this. I hope that it was a helpful thing to be able to think through. Were there any questions that were texted that we should address? There was one. We'll start with that. We're transitioning into the question and answer portion of this right now. If you want to get food or something to drink, please feel free to do that. But go ahead.
So it says, so pornography empowers selfish sex. What about couples that utilize pornography to aid sex and say it helps? Many sexuality books say it's all right and may be helpful.
Yeah. So in the relationship between the two in the couple, right, the husband and wife who are using pornography, they may be using it to enable a selfless approach to the other person, right? But they're not the only two people involved when they use pornography in their relationship. There are the people in the pornography, the people whose agency has been taken away from them. And they are being used in a selfish way. Even when they're willing to do it, they don't have agency. So they can't possibly be willing in this situation. It is selfish in that approach. Second of all, the satisfaction in sex doesn't come from the sex. It certainly is part of it, but the primary satisfaction in sex comes from the intimacy, the connection, the relationship between two people. And when couples are struggling with this, they'll do a lot of different things to try to overcome or get started or make sex happen in that relationship. But bringing somebody else in isn't really the answer, because the answer is going to come in focusing on the other individual in the relationship, finding ways to be connected with that person in that relationship. Don't dive less intimate, dive more intimate when having trouble with sex in a relationship. And the answer will come in a satisfying way there. Anything to add? Okay. Other questions or thoughts or things, points I missed, whatever.
Can we go back to your definition slide for a second?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. Sorry. Now, to be clear, this definition slide is less of, I think these things are mandatorily part of the definition, and more of, I think that these points need to inform the way that we define porn. But yes, go ahead.
I was just still just thinking, because one second. Yeah, because I just in the course of your presentation, I was just trying to understand, like, because porn, like how you defined it here, like there wasn't a definition, because before you were talking about the case study of how it was used in the criminal code.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
Or I
so
know why I see it.
Right, they would have a different definition, right? Or what exactly?
They are going to have a clear definition at the criminal level.
Yeah, I just didn't know if you're talking about like a video form, or you're talking about an imagery, or you're talking about all forms. I just started to.
I am. Any media, right? So that last one, it makes use of communicative media. So it can happen like through the books or sites where you're just reading fantasy stories, or you're just doing that. If it's designed to offer sexual arousal and to titillate, then we're going to start to put it into the category, at least, of pornography. What's key, and then so like the sort of arc of these definition pages is we start by identifying that this is so subjective if we're going to do this. But there are some things that need to inform that definition as we do it, regardless of the medium.
All right. So when you're going, for example, social media. So if you go and you see a picture, for example, of let's say a woman in a two-piece
Sure.
bathing suit, do you look at that and you say, oh, this is pornographic? Because this whole, especially the third point about agency, a lot of people have challenged that, just saying, well, if I'm in control, I'm putting an image, not necessarily for the purpose of, oh, I'm here to titillate my audience. I'm just here in terms of I work out, I have a good body, I want to present myself in this manner.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you would put that under.
Yep. And I may have overstated this in the course of the presentation, but the inherent negativity of porn, or the negative value that it has, is not due to the removal of the agency. One of the things that we need to think about when defining what porn is and isn't to us, and in general, when we're giving a definition in a group, is that the people looked at do not have agency in that situation. Not that they didn't have agency to put it out, not that they didn't have agency to make it happen, not that they even did it with the intent, right? Because the producer's intent can help define porn, and the audience's use can help define porn. Both of these things have a major play from case to case as we're figuring out whether something is obscene or pornographic.
So just
Yep.
in terms of agency, so what do you mean by just going, can you clarify what you mean by agency?
So what we're not going to say is that what this is going to exclude with this agency point is like a person stripping specifically for another person, where they have the choice to not do it, where they have agency. So the point here is to come from the perspective of the viewer and to say that the person they're viewing does not, in the situation in which they're viewing it, have agency. That's going to almost always be true when we're going to define something as pornography. Did that answer your question? Okay. That's a good question. Yeah.
But isn't what you just said also fits in the situation where you're, for example, watching Game of Thrones, and there are very explicit sexual.
Absolutely, definitely. And if that's a communicative video, you have the ability to look at that person, and for some people, watching Game of Thrones is porn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how do you personally watch Game of Thrones but still? How do you do the distinction because it's very sexually explicit?
There are no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without question, there are times when I've watched Game of Thrones and had a wrong view of sex while watching Game of Thrones.
Okay.
That's how I put it. Wrong. Yeah. But it's also possible, I think, to do it and not.
Okay. But doesn't it lead sometimes people to watch more sexually explicit content?
It can. Right. We couldn't go so far as to say it's a guarantee, but it certainly can. And the wisdom of the use of nudity by the writers of Game of Thrones is something that's very much up for debate. They did it in a remarkable way, especially as you get into, I don't want to spoil anything, but some of the powerful displays of nudity that come later on in the show that are not sexual at all, that show a naked female in a way that is not arousing, but instead is intimidating. They had a remarkable thumb on the culture in their ability to do that. And if they hadn't used sex in a titillating way and nudity in a titillating way early, then it would have been much more difficult for them to accomplish that later on in their artistic way. But no, you're right. I don't disagree at all. Yep.
To what extent would you say that porn is responsible for the level of sexual dysfunction we see in our culture today?
I need you to define sexual dysfunction. Is that possible?
You've spoken of sex in sort of an ideal way, sexuality.
Yep.
Right? So sexual dysfunction would be anything that deviates.
Okay. I think that porn has helped to normalize deviant uses of sex at a societal level. That the fact that that there is no limit on the kind of porn that can be viewed, and that they're all in the same place. Like, so someone who does go to a tube site to watch just one-on-one consensual sex, still not doing sex ideally, but at least existing within a sort of paradigm where that is the ideal kind of sex, is then subject to a lot of other things and other categories that are outside of that realm. So I think it helps to normalize those things and raise awareness of those things. I think it's difficult to attribute maybe the rise in the prominence of relationships that are not heterosexual to pornography. I think, or what, like from a cultural perspective, is the rise of those things to pornography?
Well, I wasn't even necessarily talking about
Okay.
that specific issue of like questions of, say, same-sex marriage or relationships in
Yeah.
general. I was more talking about relations between the sexes and how that's changed over time.
Okay.
And how, like from my perspective, I'd see sort of the widespread use of pornography as more of a symptom of more sort of deep-seated issues.
I agree, and this is why when I present on this, I really want more to paint a picture of what is good and healthy sex than to talk about all kinds of negatives, because we should be pursuing something, not just creating a vacuum by getting rid of things that aren't good or that aren't healthy. And I think that it's proven that porn makes men dumber about sex and about women. That it changes the way that they expect things. It often makes women insecure, and it does the vice versa. That it can make women dumber about their relationships with men and make men insecure about themselves, neither of which are healthy.
But I mean, part of the question is people, a significant amount of people, I can't so much speak for the woman, that 60% statistic.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure what kind of behavior that reflects,
Mhm.
and how similar it is to the 90%.
It's the use of porn at least once a month in order to be sexually gratified.
Okay. All right, but in any case, ultimately there's a significant amount of people that are resorting to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of them would say that this is not, comparable to the real thing.
Sure,
At least I think that's a reasonable
I agree with that.
assumption. Which begs the question, why it's so widespread if it's the less preferable of the two?
Well, ease is the short answer, right? Just accessibility. You don't have to buy dinner or anything, right? It's very simple. But also that in a more humanist culture, maybe a postmodern culture, like a subjective approach to everything is demanded, and that requires a selfish approach to sex. And porn is a symptom of that increasingly selfish approach to sex. And then using the lesser thing to get just some version of what you want is going to be the compromise that you make when it's hard.
So the sort of broader trend, selfish approach to sex would be the, I suppose, root issue.
Without question.
Yeah.
Which is why we can take it back to Genesis chapter 2.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. I'd have to think about further questions to ask.
So, related to a point you made earlier, like, is it true that just excessive viewing of pornographic material will like, desensitize you to those images so you just can't function in a normal sexual setting?
Yeah. So does pornography lead to male, specifically impotence?
Yeah.
Is a pretty common question and a very difficult one to prove. There are a lot of old myths, right? A lot of old wives' tales about how you get warts on your hand and all kinds of different things if you use porn. But and then this tends to get categorized as one of those that it's a guarantee that it's going to lead to impotence. It is very likely that continued engagement in self-gratification using pornography is going to affect a male or female's ability to have an intimate relationship because of where their brain goes and comes from when they're approaching sexual intercourse, when they're approaching physical intimacy. But that being said, at the same time, that's very overcomable when a person starts to realize that the approach shouldn't be for myself, but rather becomes about connecting with another person, then it gets overcome. Have you heard of the movie Don John? It's a Joseph Gordon-Levitt movie. It's hard to endorse because the language is rather coarse and they do use pornography. Like it's an anti-porn movie that uses pornography in a way that's probably not a great way to do it. But the point of the movie is that Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is very addicted to pornography. He starts dating Scarlett Johansson and they have a very satisfying relationship. They have a lot of sex. You know, everything about it should be fine, but he still keeps turning to porn. And she catches him and she breaks up with him. Then he meets an older woman who sort of downplays or rags on porn and says it's not about that. It's about people. It's about connection. And she sort of retrains his brain in the movie. And it's pretty well done. And they did it based on a very good amount of psychological evidence and research that's been done. So getting people out of that space is hard. But porn doesn't mean, like, if porn doesn't create male impotence, like a guaranteed need for Viagra or something like that. That's a myth, basically. Yeah.
For all these things in a short question. I brought up two boys, but I have a lot of nieces and grandchildren and others, and I'm worried about what porn has done to raising the bar. I wonder if it is porn, but I think it's other things. It's done to forever raise the bar in terms of what are acceptable transitions from young people to, you know, little kids into sexually active beings. Because if you look back 30 days pre-internet, 30 years pre-internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at what were the norms of behavior at that time, even if they weren't what was being talked about all the time. What was considered sex, what was considered risque, what was done on first dates when you were talking very much earlier. Way different than conversations we're having today, where there are a lot of young women, young men who don't even consider oral sex to be sex yet. They don't believe that they've entered. They use terms that they've not had a sexual relationship with somebody. So has porn forever raised that bar, particularly among the very young? And I don't mean that raised the bar in a very positive way. I mean sort of changed standard.
Change the standard
Yeah.
in a negative way. So it's a complicated issue, right? So not in any way to disparage the way that you raised your children, but the way that my parents were raised, who are definitely older than your children, but the way that my parents were raised, their sexual education was deeply inadequate, and I don't think that in the 80s, 90s, we really got up to speed either. Kids should be more familiar with their anatomy, with what a healthy relationship looks like, with what the anatomy of the opposite gender is at a much earlier age than they currently are in Western society, because that's healthy. They should be able to develop a safe space with their parents at a much earlier age to talk about porn. They should be taught simple steps that when you're exposed to an image that seems like a bad image, because there's good images and bad images, like even Soren can understand that idea, right? Like a little kid can understand good images and bad images, that there are simple steps you take. Get away from the image, go find somebody, tell them about it, we're going to keep you safe, all those kinds of things for their sake. So, I'm talking around your question, but the point I think to get to is maybe, like, yeah, certainly right now the standards are different for a first date, and the way people approach sex and oral sex are different, but the answer's the same. The way, the solution to that issue is the same as it was 30 years ago. It's education. It's education of children to help them have a healthy approach to sex, so that they can resist what are unhealthy approaches to sex as they get into situations. Is sexual temptation worse now than it used to be? No. Like there's nothing new under the sun. So in that way, I don't think our kids are necessarily worse off. But are there new pressures at an earlier age sometimes? Yeah, I think that's true. And I think porn has contributed to that, but so has repressive dating practices, so have the behaviors of the church that led to sexual revolution, sexual liberation in the 1970s. You know, things that people who knew that there was something good about sex were responding to, but in a humanist and poor way, by becoming just sexually promiscuous. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it true that watching porn desensitizes you to sexual arousal? He's kind of supposed to.
Let's work this a little bit. Is it true that it does that? Not in a physiological way. Not in a way that actually affects the body or makes you unable to perform. But in a psychological way, the things people watch do change. There's typically progression to the types of searches people make as they repeatedly go to pornographic sites. But at the same time, there's similar data for them revisiting videos that they really, really like on a regular basis. So from a psychological standpoint, there's not really good conclusive evidence. Yeah.
Just going on to the question before that, what would be, just with your question in consideration, what would be your opinion about the validity of those stats about the millennial generation actually having their first sexual experience later in life than previous generations?
Yeah, definition of what sexual activity is affects those statistics. Is that what you're talking about?
So you consider that stat unreliable?
I do think that that there is a difference in approach among millennials to like a sexual relationship or sexual experiences. That the value system that they have is different, and so they approach those things a little bit differently. And they do love intimacy. Like millennials and connectedness kind of go hand in hand very frequently. So their desire to have one-off type sex is not as strong as it was with maybe a child in the 80s or 90s. An adult in the 80s or 90s.
So you would view that, because a lot of these stats they specifically talk about, it's not just sexual experience. Well, I guess sexual experience would apply to virginity, but that's how this stat is generally used. I'm not sure what the source is. I don't
They're
know
losing their virginity.
I assume you've probably looked into it more than I have.
Yeah, and I think those are fascinating stats.
And you would consider that a positive?
I would consider there to be positive aspects of it, yes. That there are things about the way millennials approach relationships that are better than the way boomers did, and better than the way Generation X did, or Generation Y did. But at the same time, sometimes those statistics are also then connected to the porn statistics that they're just using that instead. And I don't know how often that's true, because there's no good statistic on that, but that they're getting what they're looking for from that early on, because they know better than to dive into relationships with famous. That's a good question. I should have a better answer for you.
Fair enough. What would you say are the positive sides of the millennial approach to this?
The desire for connectedness, the desire for when you're going to have a sexual experience, when you're going to lose your virginity, you're going to do it in a situation where you are cared about and you care. That millennials are going to value even like a collaborative approach. That there's less of that Meatloaf, the song by Meatloaf, where the woman is getting pressured for sex, and she's like, you guys know that song, it's a terrible reference to make. All right, there's less of that like classic drive the sedan to an overlooked spot and pressure your girlfriend into sex, because there's mutual respect in the millennial generation that didn't exist as much in previous generations.
So
I think that's positive.
There have been surveys that have been done, and millennials have explicitly stated.
Mr. Thompson is a better authority on millennials than I am, but we both just got asked to join a millennial task force. And there are, like, the values, the way that they approach relationships is different, and the things that they value in those relationships and then in the societies that offer those relationships are different.
All right.
Yeah. There's a question.
So I was wondering, what's your opinion on masturbation?
Right, so I'm going to go ahead and say that masturbation is never good. With the exception of certain situations where it's within, like, while having sex with the person who you're with, right? Where that's just part of the overall program. But masturbation by an individual on their own it'd be very hard to argue that it's not selfish, that it isn't inherently selfish sex. That is my opinion of masturbation. That's why I had that slide about release, that there's sort of a myth of people needing release there. Sometimes people who argue for the healthiness of masturbation will suggest that people need sexual release. They absolutely need it. And there are two things built into our bodies that handle that, right? For men, the ability to reabsorb unused semen, and the wet dream. The wet dream is a thing that you're not guilty of, right? It's not a sin to have a wet dream. It's not wrong. It's a natural thing that happens to a person. 8% of all dreams are sexual, and it's a natural way to handle that if that's an issue for a person. That's really hard, right? Because being alone, like, we were made to be in relationship. We were made to be intimate and connected with people, and part of that is sex, and part of our sex drive is to drive us towards those relationships. And when that's not being satisfied, that's difficult. But it's very hard to make an argument that it's not selfish sex. Yeah.
I had two questions. My first one was, what sources do you think should be most, I guess, influential, like, as you're running your sex education program? And my second one was, what would you respond to someone who says that they use porn not for the purpose of, use the word titillate or whatever, or just for the purpose of education? They don't know what to do, and so they turn to porn for that.
Yeah, so in a very, second question first. In a very pure sense, there's a way for that argument to work. It's difficult because we should remember that the producer has to do with the definition of porn, and the intent of the producer has to do with the definition of porn. There are things that are designed to teach people how to have healthy sex that aren't designed, actually designed as profit-making, sexual using machines. So those would probably be better sources to turn to than pornography. We should also remember that pornography is going to, they're not trying to hold a high bar. They're not trying to set some standard for what good and bad sex is. They are simply trying to make money out of people and trying to control where their eyes are going. So it's a very dangerous thing to turn to in order to get a healthy perspective on what good sex is and how to do it. I would also say that prior to the existence of visual communication tools, people had sex and they were satisfied by it and they were happy with it. They talked to each other about how to do it. And we need to be a society that is able to talk openly about good sex with one another in relationships where we're comfortable to do so. Like, it'd be great for your church group to have a small group of, or for your church to have a small group of newlyweds who can just talk openly about what sex is like and here's something we found that has worked well, and here's something we found hasn't, and things of that nature. Like, that's a pure and good thing to be able to do when we can do it in a pure and good context. So you can use pornography to be educated. That's like I can see a like very, very idealistic scenario where that works, but there's probably better ways. So then what should be used for sex education? What sources should exist? It's very difficult to get around the sex education that exists in schools currently, so that's just going to be there, right? But I am a huge proponent of parents or caregivers, if in a case where there isn't parents. There are many, many excellent children's books, picture-type books that have been designed to help kids get initiated in the conversation about sex. There are books that are designed for kids who are in their adolescent years, and things that the child and parent can sit down and do together, child and caregiver can sit down and do together. We have listed a lot of them on the Conquerors Through Christ website. We review them and take a look at them, and I think there's some really good ones out there. And when it comes to sex education, it's important to remember that we are helping an individual understand service, that we are helping a person be as empathetic and caring as they can possibly be for another person. And as we educate with that, a lot of things naturally follow. So heavy involvement with parents, huge fan of heavy involvement with parents. I think our churches should not be doing sex education, but should be equipping parents and caregivers to do that. And then in a rare case where a kid does not have someone to do that for them, should step in and help. And then that it's really about teaching a philosophy as much as it's about teaching a style or a practice. Because there are important health issues to be considered. You guys are great. Like, these questions are fantastic. But I really appreciate them. Are there? Should I stop?
We should.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for your time.
Continue more.
I sincerely appreciate it. Thanks for listening.
Alright, so a couple last things. First of all, again, big thanks to Kent Reader who was able to come and do that for us. So we're with the Club Illuminate. We do regular meetings on Friday nights at 212 Ring Lane. So we have some information over here for you. If you're interested, come and join us. We always have free dinner. We always have free discussion. Right now we're doing a series on true and reasonable. So is our faith reasonable, and how do we share a God that remains hidden? So we also have some surveys here as well. So take one of those, fill it out. We have some candy as well as a thank you. If you haven't gotten one yet, we have some free water bottles, some free information about that as well. So please feel free to take anything there. And again, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you.
And if you fill out the survey, then you get a cool water bottle. That's the way it works.